Hey, how's it going, folks? Josh here. Of course, 86 Boxing, or should I say 86 Boxing History, since that's kind of the marquee banner for the channel right there. 86 Boxing History, that seems pretty fitting right there. Of course, I'm going to keep it as 86 Boxing, but just know when you think 86 Boxing, hopefully there's the thought that it's synonymous with none other than 86 Boxing History, baby. But yeah, I hope all is well. Here for about an hour. I'll say that. Sometimes we can go super long or whatnot, but here for an hour. So appreciate everyone. Salute to all who are here in attendance. Big shout out to Dan. Dan, the man there. Appreciate you there, Dan. Thanks for dropping by. Says, oh boy. Yes, indeed, there, Dan. Because as you know, we're talking Australian boxing history, baby. Cheers, John Sharp. Hey, glad to have you here, buddy. Great chatting. Excuse me. Great chatting with you there in the comments. Salute to John Sharp, Derek. Be sure to go check him out. Larry Foley, the phrase happy as Larry came from the legend, Aussie legend. Okay, gotcha. Yes, indeed, right there. One of the great trainers that the sport of boxing has seen, Larry Foley. And he was a fighter himself, folks. A fighter himself. So we'll talk about some Larry Foley. So Dan sends his salute. Then, of course, salute to Rodolfo Rivera Jr. there in the mix. Be sure to check out Rodolfo Rivera Jr., folks. Member there. Appreciate you there, Rodolfo. As always, great chatting with you. Rodolfo, of course, I know you're a fan of boxing history as well. Getting a couple of things set up here. I have to open up the Facebook audience because, StreamYard changed it to where when you go live on Facebook, it doesn't add, or when you add Facebook and you go live, it doesn't automatically show it to the audience. Well, it wasn't StreamYard. It was more so Facebook making some updates of some type, always throwing a wrench in things. But that being said, we are here. So, yeah, as mentioned, about an hour. So might as well jump into it, I guess, from an overall standpoint. But we're talking Australian boxing, baby. Australian boxing. And, man, this is one of the continents and country essentially that has been a great steward to the sport of boxing. I mean, you can't tell the history of boxing without including in it in some capacity right there, because they just had so many great fighters that were involved, and that factors in. That's a big piece of what got the sport to the point that it is now. So we can start pretty much around the eras that we generally start, which tie back to the late 1800s. And then from a late 1800s perspective, if you think about it, there are a number of heavyweights that played a significant role in boxing, especially when you're thinking about the Marquess of Queensberry rules, thinking about that aspect of it. But also when you think about those that even did some bare knuckle. But, I don't know a ton about the world of bare knuckle. I do know some things. But that being said, you had a mix of some of everything that was happening in or around Australia during the late 1800s. So there in the 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, they played a major, major role, as mentioned. And that's something we have to talk about. So I want to start with Bill Farnan. So I know, Dan, you've brought him up. It's been mentioned. Bill Farnan is one of those individuals who was a Australian heavyweight champion, as a matter of fact. Didn't have a ton of fights there when you see it listed under the Marquess of Queensberry rules, about 20. But that being said, he was one of those heavyweights that was on top of his game there, late 1800s. So early on, and I'm going to pull up his record, but significantly, of course, he defeated Peter Jackson, who we'll get to, but not just once, but he defeated Peter Jackson multiple times, if I'm not mistaken there. Or could I be mistaken? Let me see. Yeah. Oh, no, I'm right here. Hold on. Yeah, he defeated him multiple times. That is right. So in 1884 and in July of 1884 and then September of 1884. So he defeated Peter Jackson. He beat him to win the inaugural Australian Heavyweight Championship, the first Australian Heavyweight Champion in boxing history right there. Bill Farnan. That's why we certainly have to talk about him. And we're talking about the heavyweights mainly because the heavyweights played a significant role, but it wasn't just heavyweights. So we'll talk about some others who were not heavyweights who are also equally as good as far as their impact, what they were able to do in the sport of boxing. And I think that factors in there. And everyone sends their regards here in the chat. But Dan says, beat up the great Peter Jackson in Jackson's prime. I think that can be questioned right there, Dan. I think the prime aspect of it can be questioned. Now, he did beat him up for sure. He did. I believe he stopped him at least once, right? Let me see here. Yep, he stopped him. Yeah, one of those times he did stop Peter Jackson. And the question of whether he was in his prime, though, then I feel, that could be lobbied. That was, I feel, earlier in Jackson's career. He had about less than 10 fights under his belt. Not that Farnan had as many himself. When you look at it from the big picture of things, he was not too far off from that. But he did have some experience there. Now, he was able to defeat Jackson, as mentioned, and Jackson just was not able to overcome Bill Farnan in order to win the Australian heavyweight title. Of course, Jackson would go on to become Australian heavyweight champion, and he just couldn't overcome it and win that title at the stead of none other than Bill Farnan. So just wanted to mention Farnan. And there's a video on the channel where I'm talking about John L. Sullivan. It questions were the best matchups possible fought by John L. Sullivan at that particular time. And it just really kind of throws out some of those individuals that were in the mix in or around when John L. Sullivan was fighting that could have potentially added that extra marker, that extra oomph to his record. Certainly Bill Farnan was one of those guys. Of course, Australia and America, or at least the United States of America, and any of the Americas, really, they aren't necessarily just close right there. So you think about it, even back during those times, that's a long trip. So not everyone was going to make it. You could argue that maybe Bill Farnan would have had to make the trip and truly lobby for fighting Sullivan. But all of his fights took place, as far as I know, at least all of his official fights, in Australia. Now, that doesn't mean that Farnan wasn't just as capable, because Australia, during those times, as far as Australia and the Australian heavyweight title, it had just as much weight as the American heavyweight title, or what some would consider the world heavyweight title. Of course, you had the interesting dynamic of fights taking place under different forms of rule sets. So you had London prize ring rules, which is generally bare knuckle, though you will see accounts of London prize ring rule fights where they may have had on gloves of some type. Sometimes there would be skin tight gloves, some that you might put on if you were going to the driving range, or if you were driving, or if you were think about football, a wide receiver, probably not even as thick as that or as those, but you had just something on your hands. Or you might have 2-ounce gloves, but just think about that. So they were fighting in that capacity. Of course, you had some bare knuckle stuff in general that was taking place. Then Marcus of Queensberry rules came into the fold. So Marcus of Queensberry rules coming into the fold was something that definitely kind of upped the ante a bit, because it helped with a lot of the legal issues that were taking place in the United States of America as it related to fighting. But even beyond that, in a lot of places, even in places where it was more holistically accepted, it wasn't necessarily accepted by all. So even England, for instance, which played a significant role. But Farnan, as Dan mentions, I think Farnan has an incomplete record. Record keeping was very bad back then in Australia, no doubt about it. I'm pretty positive he had more, as you mentioned there, Dan. And Dan mentions that was a great show Josh did about the list of guys Sutherland could have fought. A lot of Australia fighters, most certainly there. And essentially, that's what I was getting at there, Dan. So Bill Farnan was one of those guys. And I think he and Sullivan would have been a hell of a matchup right there. But for some reason, it just did not happen. It couldn't be made. And the two never got to face each other. But as mentioned, Bill Farnan, he was in there with some of the other top guys, especially the Australian fighters from that time, and played a significant role. So in addition to the likes of Peter Jackson, he also defeated Tom Lees, or he drew with Tom Lees, as a matter of fact. That's who won the title from him. So Tom Lees, he was in there with Frank Slavin as well, who we'll get to. Now, Tom Lees, he's someone, as far as the searching that I've done, and I believe it's pretty much known at this particular point, there's no picture of Tom Lees, so we don't know what he looks like. Maybe something pops up at some point in the future, or maybe he's out there in a picture and he's just unidentified because, of course, Australia was filming fights in addition to Australia, of course, having a ton of pictures that are tied to matchups, things of that nature that took place there. But you have to think in terms of this particular time period, it wasn't as prevalent. And most of the pictures you will see where fighters came in intentionally imposed. But a lot of the ringside depictions, things of that nature, you don't necessarily have photos of such. But there is some stuff out there. We do have pictures of some individuals that came before Tom Lees. So you just never know. And hey, maybe he's out there somewhere. But as of right now, there's no picture of him or no picture that I've run across. But, I'll continue to look. I don't know if I've made a very concerted effort in trying to find one, but certainly that's something worth mentioning. Shout out to my mom who dropped in and says, hello, son. She dropped into the live there. Appreciate you there. Thanks for dropping by. As always, there, mother. Dan mentions Farnan beat up Jackson bad twice in 1884. Indeed, he gave Jackson that work. That's something Jackson had to certainly learn from, and I think that he did, because he would go on to be one of the most formidable heavyweights in the history of the sport. And during that period, you could argue the top guy as far as billing. That is one Black Prince, Peter Jackson. And I didn't really get much into Tom Lee, so I don't know a ton about Tom Lee in terms of what his overall fighting style was, but a heck of a resume as far as you're thinking about some of the guys that he faced during his career. I'll throw that out there. Some that will probably be names that you have heard before. Of course, Peter Jackson, that's someone he was in with. You mentioned Bill Farnan. He fought Peter Jackson a number of times, as a matter of fact. And so just think about these type of guys are helping to build Jackson. This is early in Jackson's career. And it's actually Tom Lees who Jackson won the world heavyweight title from, or the Australian heavyweight title, pardon. And remember, Jackson couldn't defeat Bill Farnan, but he was able to defeat Tom Lees. But I'm thinking certainly he would have had to learn something from Bill Farnan as he went through that mix. And Joe Goddard, that's another name. We'll have to bring him up. Frank Slavin, that's another name. We'll have to bring him up, who's on the resume there of Tom Lees. Mission Boy, Joe McAuliffe, he's another name, not Australian, American, but that being said, Tom Lees, not a guy often mentioned, thought about, I would say, from that perspective, and he played a pretty solid, significant role. Thanks there, Dan. Thanks for the warm regards there. Appreciate you there, Dan. So Bill Farnan, Tom Lees, two very significant ones. And then, of course, we can move on to none other than the Black Prince, Peter Jackson, which I know a little bit more about the Black Prince, of course, than Tom Lees and Bill Farnan. Black Prince, Peter Jackson, I mean, there's not a ton you can't say about him and his impact to the sport. So I'll pull up the picture there for those viewing, or at least a depiction that you can see there. 42 wins, 29 by knockout, 5 losses, 3 draws, 27 no decision bouts, 28 no contests. So, as mentioned, sometimes these records are incomplete, or if you go on to say the likes of a box rec, usually it's going to have a number of the fights listed there, and you won't necessarily see the record in the full capacity there, because you're only going to see what they consider the official fights, because you had a number of newspaper decisions, things of that nature that went on during that period. And that certainly factors in. And as Dan mentions, Peter Jackson, one of the greatest heavyweights to ever step in the ring, most certainly. But when you factor that in, newspaper decisions, those should be counted. Of course, I count them. I mention them. I talk about them all the time. So when you think about, when I'm speaking of a fighter and I'm talking about wins and losses, etc., then I'm factoring in the newspaper decisions, even if you don't look at them as wins or losses and just kind of have them as no decisions. Still, the fights took place, and we learned a great deal by going through that process, essentially. So newspaper, no decision bouts, those things were common. And when you factor all of that stuff in, it gives you more of the records for some of these individuals. And Black Prince Peter Jackson is one of those. He at one point went on an amazing run where he was just running through fighters, heavyweights, that is, throughout Australia, England, and the United States, as he was in search of a world heavyweight title shot with John L. Sullivan. And that ultimately did not materialize, though they did have a run-in or two, and they had a lot of back and forth, a lot of communication between the two individuals and their teams or camps, whatever you want to call it. But the fight in itself never did materialize there when you really dive into it. Shout out to Eudes Fernandez. Salute. Appreciate you there, Eudes. So thank you for dropping by. I think I'm getting your name right. I always mix it up somewhat, but I think it's Eudes Fernandez. But hey, always great to have you in the mix here, and love having the chats, dialogue, discussions, etc. Again, thanks all that are listening, joining right now. We're talking Australian boxing history, or at least some Australian boxing history, primarily focusing on the late 19th and early 20th century. So it's worthwhile, to chat about those eras, because those are often forgotten but played such a significant role. So we're talking about the Black Prince Peter Jackson. And once again, I'll bring up the depiction there. The Black Prince Peter Jackson, originally from the West Danish Indies, which is now the U.S. Virgin Islands, as of 1917 at least. But he was a citizen in Australia as well. So his adopted home, where he is widely recognized, and where, of course, he got in the bulk of his work, especially there early on, learning his trade, that happened in Australia. So that's why you'll see Peter Jackson tied to Australia. Some probably think he's from Australia or was born there. That was not the case, but he is very much accepted, recognized, and is considered to be an Australian heavyweight or an Australian heavyweight champion. So that's just something that is kind of thrown in the mix there. Now, I have a video on the channel that dives into the career of, or at least a little bit into the career of Peter Jackson as well. This is one from a couple of years ago. It was early on, so it doesn't go over every tidbit or everything, or dive as deep as some of the more recent and more modern videos that I've done. But that being said, you get a little bit of a taste of some of the people he ended up facing, some of the things he went through in his career. But I think you really get a more better or consistent view when you look at the John L. Sullivan video, which is centered on, I forget the exact title of it, but if you look on the channel, it's one that was from about a year ago. We're speaking on John L. Sullivan and some of the fighters he could have faced that the fights didn't ever materialize. And of course, Peter Jackson is one of those individuals. So you dive into some stories, some things that you didn't get in the other video that's on the channel that is from like 2 or more years ago. So I wanted to mention that. But Peter Jackson, like I had said, he at one point was just scooping up titles. He's had the colored world heavyweight title. At one point, he was the longest reigning colored world heavyweight title. You might recall I posted a picture a number of weeks back where I said he was the longest reigning. I was thinking off top, and I was thinking he was the longest reigning. It turns out I didn't recall Harry Wills, who was actually had the belt a little bit longer by 41 days, that is. Now, the, of course, difference, caveat, whatever you want to call it, is that Harry Wills, when he won the colored world heavyweight title, it was during the period in which Jack Johnson had already won the world heavyweight title when he defeated Tommy Burns. Now, the interesting thing about that, of course, is Jack Johnson didn't give guys like Harry Wills a shot at the title. So the colored world heavyweight title, it essentially maintained and it stayed in rotation there. So Harry Wills had Black Prince Peter Jackson by 41 days as far as their overall range there. And that being said, when Peter Jackson vacated the title, even a number of years after he died or whatever, several years after he died, more than a decade, as you could say, he was the longest reigning world or colored world heavyweight champion at that period because of the fact that he held it for a significant period of time when he was on top of his game. And there was a point in time when, as far as it related to the two best heavyweights in the world, it really came down to John L. Sullivan and Peter Jackson. Yes, we didn't get that fight. Or no, we didn't get that fight. But man, that video that I'm mentioning, we touch on some of the reasonings behind it not happening, the potential, and I think it would have been one of the most significant contests to have taken place in the history of boxing, not just heavyweight boxing, but the history of boxing in general, because you have to think about it. Of course, you had a number of other divisions, but the heavyweight division is what ran things. The heavyweight division was the pinnacle, the upper echelon of the sport. So if heavyweights were fighting, if the heavyweight champion was around, then that was the man right there. You can essentially say the baddest man on the planet, kind of a term that has been used. So John L. Sullivan, he was recognized as the world heavyweight champion in 1889 when he defeated Jake Kilrain in a bare knuckle contest, London prize ring rules contest. Basically, that was sort of a unification of what would have been the American heavyweight title that John L. Sullivan had already in his possession, and the world heavyweight title, though bare knuckle, that Jake Kilrain was recognized as having won by the National Police Gazette when he defeated Jim Smith in 1887. Now, Sullivan, of course, we know, beat Kilrain, and therefore that is why he was officially recognized as the world heavyweight champion. Prior to that contest, there were those that did recognize him as world heavyweight champion, but that wasn't necessarily the case for all. And of course, the National Police Gazette at that point hadn't recognized him as world heavyweight champion. And if he would have fought Peter Jackson, then we would have had a contest where you had the colored world heavyweight champion, so the best black fighter in the world, taking on the world heavyweight champion, and by proxy, of course, John L. Sullivan being considered the best heavyweight there in the world. So that's what we missed out on, and it would have been highly significant there. Then also Greco-Roman American wrestling champion world lived to 92. Oh yeah, word. That's pretty cool. That is pretty darn awesome right there. You mentioning how this William Miller, strongest man on earth, heavyweight champion of Australia, the first also wrestling and fencing champion. Oh, okay, gotcha right there, Dan. Yeah, that's pretty awesome right there. That is pretty awesome. I know wrestling played a significant role. That's something we've mentioned before as well. How wrestling during that period, that was a means, or at least there were different means in which boxers train, learn different things, especially when you're thinking about the bare knuckle world. You wanted to know how to grab, get a fighter, position a fighter, take them down if you needed to, you know. So a lot of that was established with some of these top wrestlers. And so William Miller, I don't know William Miller to speak on his career there, Dan, but certainly I know some other wrestlers who played a role in the sport. I've mentioned them before, a number of them. And that is most certainly William Muldoon. He's one. Frank Gotch. That's another. There's another. He is considered to be a pioneer from that time. I can't think of his name right now, but the picture is in my mind. But that being said, those are a few that come to mind. Of course, then you have the term catch wrestling that was kind of turned and thrown in the mix there. So Dan mentions those. Also, real quick comments wise, shout out to Boz, Bad Boz in the building there. Says, cheers. Says, Josh, just going to say salute and greetings. This is not something I know much about, so I cannot contribute really. It's all good there, Boz. Appreciate having you here, buddy, as always. So be sure to go check out Boz there. Give him a follow. And check us out on Sundays for Boxing Chit, 11 a.m. now Eastern time, but also just check your local listenings, of course, you know, depending on where you are. The Clue, hey, cheers. What's going on? The Clue says, what up, Josh? Have there been any fighters from Aboriginal descent? You know, that's a very, very good question right there. Day Clue. I don't know off top. As far as Aboriginal, I know there have been those of Maori descent for sure. Now you can tie them to, and that's thinking, you know, from a New Zealand standpoint. But that being said, Aboriginal boxers, I'm sure there might have been some that are out there, but here just thinking about it off top, especially those at a top level, I can't say for sure. One fighter I know of who was from Australia, who probably could have fit the billing, is a guy by the name of Young Pluto. He didn't have a ton of fights, and he didn't reach that top tier level to the highest degree, but that's someone I'm thinking of who might fit the billing, but I don't know enough about him, at least at this current juncture, to know if he was Aboriginal or not. But he could have very well been, or he could have just been someone who was of a darker complexion who might have been tied to, you know, another country or something, or at least from a family lineage standpoint. So Young Pluto's who I think of. But yeah, really outside of him, from an Aboriginal standpoint, especially dating back to those times, then yeah, I can't really think of. Oh, there's Dion. Hey, salute there to you, Dion. Clubs. That's so funny. But Clubber D right there. So shout out to the Ball and Budge podcast. Be sure to check that out, folks. Go follow that because he has some good content that he provides there on the channel. So be sure to check him out for sure there. So all right, got you there, Dion. Yeah, I can't think of any off top who are Aboriginal. That's one worth looking into. I have something on the channel regarding some Maori fighters, or have videos where they're thrown in the mix. Herbert Slade is one I did not too long ago, who is an interesting one for sure. Bad Boss says, all I want to say is Jimmy Carruthers, LOL, but he fought the late 40s, 50s, 60s. Oh, yeah. Yeah, we know of him. Is good stuff there, Vibes. Dan mentions Dan Miller was 55-11 in boxing, beat Larry Foley in 40 rounds for the first Australian heavyweight champion. Okay, cool. Got that. That's pretty dope right there. And, you know, Larry Foley, a trainer of Peter Jackson, who we were just discussing. So Peter Jackson, one of the best heavyweights in the history of the sport, trained by Larry Foley. And at one point in time, while he and Sullivan were both right there, fighting, competing. There were those that felt the best fighter in the world, not just the best heavyweight in the world. The best fighter in the world was Peter Jackson. And hey, you got to think about the likes of a Larry Foley and the role that he played in a guy like that becoming what he was. Not just him, there are others that Larry Foley trained. Yeah. And, I want to do a video on Larry Foley. Certainly one has been considered, might be in tap at some point here in the future. But then I think that would kind of just give you a true feel for just the role of one great Larry Foley as a fighter and trainer, his contributions to the sport. Bad Boz says, I got a new Strictly Boxing channel. Boz's Boxing, but it's under construction. All right, cool there, Boz. Shout out to Boz's Boxing. All right, we'll have to link that, connect on that right there. So we'll be on the lookout there, Boz. I'll get with you in that regard. It says subscribe. It'll soon feature videos. Got you there, Boz. We got you. For sure. Drop it in the chat there. Cheers there to Alexander Campbell. Says, catch is catch. Can wrestling was real and all holds allowed. All right, got you there, Alexander Campbell. Salute to you. Appreciate seeing you here, Alex. As always, great to chat. So it's mentioned catch wrestling, and that played a significant role in the sport of boxing in those early days, or bare knuckle boxing, London prize ring rules, you name it. But there are a lot of wrestling guys that were working with boxers, and a number of wrestling guys who competed in boxing as well. That was another sport that they jumped into. And of course, when you think about the money that could be exchanged, things of that nature, especially thinking about becoming a heavyweight champion in boxing or something of that tune, then you'd understand why that you had a number of crossover athletes in that sense. So great having you here, Alex. Shout out to Rasclot 222. Be sure to check out Rasclot 222. Sending salutes to everyone there. Appreciate you there, Rasclot, and check him out. He has some content on this channel where he gets into boxing, modern and history there. Dan mentions Harry Lang was called Fighting Mari, but he really wasn't Mari. He was half Irish, quarter Spanish, quarter black, one of the greatest. That is it. That is definitely the case. Harry Lang, he was someone I wanted to mention. Now, he falls into the New Zealand category. Of course, we know how close and significant the two countries are to each other. That being said, Harry Lang, he is a New Zealand heavyweight who ran up a record where he only lost. I believe he only lost one fight there. I don't have it up. Let me see. I believe he only lost one fight in 30-plus fights or something, thinking about it from an official record standpoint. But that being said, he's another guy. This showed just the level of fighter or heavyweights that they had there in that particular area. And those guys down there, if you were in Australia, of course you fought New Zealanders. You fought Tasmanians. So there were those that were fighting in Tasmania. Someone, maybe a number of them probably had what was considered the Tasmanian heavyweight title, or title that was tied to Tasmania. I know I've seen that. I just can't think of who now, but it could have been a number of them. But just think about that. David Tua, that's another one that's mentioned there, Dan. Definitely modern times here for sure. Lionel Rose was Aboriginal. Okay, good stuff there, Alexander Campbell. Yeah, and Lionel Rose, I don't know a ton about him. A bit more on the modern side here in terms of by comparison, but that's what's up. I know his name for sure. So he's Aboriginal. Awesome. So there you go right there, Dion. There's one for sure. Rasclot mentions it as well there. Okay, appreciate y'all. Yeah, that's good stuff. Dan mentioned the Aboriginal who fought John L. Sullivan. Remember, he was a great fighter. He just can't remember. So he was actually Mari there, Dan. You're talking about Herbert Slade. Yeah, he was from down under. He came in undefeated, and Sullivan handled him fairly easy in actuality. I have a video out there on him, and it's called something to do with crossing the color line because of Maori descent. As mentioned, he was someone that John L. Sullivan had fought there. It was like 1883 or somewhere around that time frame, and they thought Slade was going to be someone who could really trouble Sullivan. Big guy, of course. He was bigger than Sullivan, but yeah, Sullivan handled him. Lionel Rose beat Fighting Harada. Okay. Fighting Harada. Yeah. That's what's up right there. Hall of Famer there. Japanese fighter fighting Harada. So okay, that's good stuff for sure. That's significant. Bad Bobs mentioned not many famous or known Maori boxers, really. Even those that fight out of New Zealand are mostly Samoans or sometimes Tongans. Gotcha there. There's some, but yeah, dating back to these times, yeah, you had some. I would say the famous during this period was, in all likelihood, Herbert Slade. He had gained a lot of following and fanfare, but there were some others that were in or around there. Torpedo Billy Murphy, he's one, I believe, or Torpedo Billy Smith. Let me see, what was the name? Torpedo Bill. I think it's Torpedo Billy Murphy, and he was Torpedo Billy Murphy. I was going to do a video on him. I actually got a paragraph that I started some significant time ago, more than a year ago, I believe, at this point, or close to it, damn close to it. But Torpedo Billy Murphy, I believe, is a flyweight world champion. Let's see here, featherweight world champion out of New Zealand. So if you don't know him, look him up. I'm gonna do a video on him at some point. As mentioned, I got like a paragraph, maybe even 2 paragraphs. It's been so long since I opened it up, but hell of a fighter right there. Hell of a fighter, I will say. Jimmy Thunder. Oh, yeah, Jimmy Thunder. He had one of those fastest knockouts. It was only a couple of seconds or a few seconds. I can't remember exactly how quick that was. Yeah, as Raz Clock mentions there, Bob, let us know when the channel is ready. Get that thing right and get it going. Pio Wolfgram is from Tonga. I don't know him there, Bob. You got me right there. Stuck me with that one. I don't know him. Tour man. Oh, yeah. Panama Young Secano. Yep, don't know those guys there, Boz. Yeah, you're throwing out some names there for sure. Tasmanian too. Harry Lang only lost to Frank Slavin in his prime, KO'd him. Okay, good stuff right there. So Harry Lang, he lost to Frank Slavin. I knew it was only like once that he lost. So again, hey, welcome. If you're just joining, salute to everyone in the mix here. We're talking Australian boxing history, at least to a certain degree, mainly looking at the heavyweights. But that being said, there were others, as mentioned, that were in and around those weights. And of course, you're talking Australian boxing by proxy, by location, New Zealand and areas in or around there fall into the category, or at least fall into the mix as well, or they played a role, most certainly. Harry Lang's mother was Tasmanian, says Dan. Okay, that's cool. Dan mentioned Herbert Slade was great, though. Huge. Yes, indeed. Indeed. Maurice Samoan's a big guy, strong. Yes, indeed. We've seen that for sure. Not many welterweights there, says Boz. Yes, certainly. KO artist Don Perel, KO Murphy there, Dan mentions. Gotcha. Great champion, indeed. The Boxing Kangaroo, thanks for dropping by. It says 86 salute, brother. Salute there to you, Boxing Kangaroo. Appreciate you there, buddy. Be sure to go check out the Boxing Kangaroo, folks. As mentioned, we're talking a little bit of boxing there, or Australian boxing there. The Boxing Kangaroo mentions Jimmy Thunder from New Zealand. Okay, yep. New Zealand, significant role made and played there. Danny Medina, salute there to you, Danny Medina. Appreciate you dropping by there, buddy. Appreciate everyone who's in here right now. We're talking a little Australian boxing. Boxing Kangaroo is listening at work. Appreciate you there. Indeed, the Boxing Kangaroo. Salute to you. Wolfgram, Boz mentions, was a 96 Olympic silver medalist, and later he fought Vlad Klitschko. Okay. Good to go. I imagine that video's out there. Might have to check him out. I believe he beat Jimmy Thunder. Okay. That's what's up there, Boz. Yeah, I didn't know that. Big, heavy guy. Okay, cool. Jimmy Thunder died recently. Dan is mentioning this, living in the streets in Las Vegas, lost his mind. Oh, wow. Didn't know that. That's pretty crazy. Sometimes you see some of those sad endings for sure. Now, the Boxing Kangaroo mentioned his favorite Aussie light heavyweight was Jeff Hitman Harding. His 12th round KO over Dennis Andres was a great fight to watch. I don't know or really anything about him. I got to check that out right there, the Boxing Kangaroo. I have to check that out. So 12th round KO. That's big time right there. It shows that metal have a little mustard there as the rounds go on, and a lot of guys can't do that for sure. Guys and gals, a lot of them can't do that. Bad Bob says, very sad, Dan. He was The Rock's cousin. Oh, didn't know that either. KO Murphy and Young Griffo. Yeah, Young Griffo, when I was thinking about those that were of different weights, I certainly think about Young Griffo. He's one who falls into the mix there of Australian greats who contributed there to the sport. Former, bantamweight champion or the featherweight? Somewhere around there, bantamweight or featherweight, but I believe it was bantamweight or lightweight even. Somewhere in the mix there. I have to look it up, but certainly Young Griffo, and he has a pretty amazing record and resume when you look at it. Didn't really lose a ton of fights and fought a hell of a lot of fights. We're talking 100 plus. He might have been near or in that 200 range from what I recall. And I've done some videos where he comes into the mix just by virtue of some of the competitors he fought against during that period. Oh, yeah, Jim Hall. Yeah, that's another one right there, Dan. I know Jim Hall. Solid guy right there. Mick Dooley. I was thinking of Mick Dooley earlier, Dan, as well. This is a heavyweight, Mick Dooley, that is. Mick Dooley, he played a role as well in the sport and was one of those fighters that was significant from that area. And during this same era where we're talking about some of these guys here. So, again, we're talking Australian boxing, the significance of such. And as mentioned, it played such a major role in the sport from the standpoint of the late 19th century or late 20th century and late 19th century and early 20th century, rather. It played such a significant role. Some other guys we wanted to mention, we kind of touched on to a certain degree, thinking about like the likes of Peter Jackson and such. Think about Frank Slavin. That's another one who was in the mix there. Someone who could have faced John L. Sullivan. There's a lot of communication. You can see that stuff in the newspapers and such, where the two of them were at some point going to compete. Now, it ultimately did not happen. Largely, I would say, because of Sullivan. Now, in the case of Sullivan, it was at this period of time there in the sport for him where he wasn't fighting as often and he wasn't dedicated to his training very much. You could argue a lot. He spent a number of years being in that type of situation, and therefore that kind of played things because during this period where we're thinking at the back end of the 1880s, from 1885 up, really Sullivan was one of those guys that it was hard to get him in the ring. And when you could get him in the ring, he needed a significant amount of time to train. And that's because he had so many out of the ring things going on that he was just a hard guy to pin down, a hard guy to remain focused, and training wasn't necessarily at the forefront. So that played a role in the fact that he and Paddy Slavin never fought. Now, Frank Slavin, I mentioned it in a video I completed recently. I can't remember. Oh, yeah, Joe Butler. If you haven't seen that video, check it out. But I mentioned him in the Joe Butler video, but he's also in that Sullivan video that I was speaking of there on the channel. And I'll have to drop the link to that I'll drop the link to that in the chat here in a sec. But basically, Frank Slavin, this guy about 6'2" heavyweight and solid 200-pound guy who could punch. You could equate him to essentially being like the Jack Dempsey of that particular period. And that's because, man, he was just a big time puncher there in the sport. And of course, he has a hell of a resume. Just mind you, any of these guys that I'm mentioning, they had a hell of a resume just by the fact that they were fighting a number of the other guys from Australia, New Zealand, and other areas there. So Slavin was one of those guys. Excellent resume. He didn't really lose a ton of fights, and he was in with some top-level guys. Big-time puncher, as I mentioned. He was at one point, he faced Peter Jackson. That's one he faced. I remember at one point he was claiming the Australian heavyweight title at the same period or time frame that Peter Jackson had it. And Peter Jackson was like, hey, I'm going to fight him just because he's claiming this. And, of course, Slavin handled him. I mean, not Slavin, but Jackson handled him, rather. So Peter Jackson, he was in the mix there. And I was going to say that Slavin, he played a big role back then. And just think about that, him being mentioned amongst the likes of a John L. Sullivan. That shows you the level of fighter he was. I mentioned he was in there with the Slavins or in there with the Peter Jacksons of the world. Pull up. I have his record. I'm just going to give you some of the names that Frank Slavin was in with. He actually fought Frank Gotch. Wow, interesting. Frank Slavin fought Frank Gotch. Look up Frank Gotch if you don't know Frank Gotch. That's all I'll say right there. But Slavin was in there with the Tom Lees, as mentioned. Joe Butler, he was a middleweight, king of the middleweights. Check out that video, but he fought heavyweights. Bob Armstrong, king of the battle royal, right there. Jake Kilrain, who fought Sullivan. Bob Armstrong, former colored world heavyweight champion, and impressive resume. Jake Kilrain, great bare knuckler and boxer. He had a pretty solid overall boxing resume and competed in a number of fights, definitely at 40 plus, getting towards 50 there under the Marquess of Queensberry rules. So that might be something that not as many know about Jake Kilrain, but he did compete in the he did compete in a number of fights under the Marquess of Queensberry rules. Peter Marr, that's another one. Frank Slavin was in there. The Irish Giant, former claimant of the world heavyweight title, though he never officially won the world heavyweight title. And even at one point, he and Bob Fitzsimmons had fought, of course. Frank Craig, more so middleweight. That's another name there that Slavin was in with. But Peter Jackson, as mentioned. Let me see some others right here. Charlie Mitchell, he fought at heavyweight. He's the English fighter. I have a video of Charlie Mitchell on the channel. I could probably create another one to do him even more justice because he was a great fighter anyway. That's why I'm telling you, these individuals that were fighting out of Australia, top tier, no doubt about it. And Charlie Mitchell fought for the world heavyweight title, just FYI. So that shows you the level and degree of fighter in which he was. So Frank Slavin, if you don't know, I want to do a video on Frank Slavin that dives a bit deeper into his overall career and what to do, because right now he's more so just being kind of a part of different videos that I've made, but certainly someone worth looking into. Indeed there. So Dan mentions Mick Dooley was Australian heavyweight champion, but he was only a middleweight. He dominated Fitzsimmons, but some were fixed apparently. Interesting for sure. Very interesting right there. Yeah, I knew of Dooley, and the fact that he fought and dominated Fitzsimmons, I didn't recall that. So I have to look into that there, Dan. But fixing, of course, we know we've heard that term in the sport of boxing for sure. And yeah, what can we say? Dan mentions once again, Frank Slavin KO'd Mick Dooley. Well, yes, sir. Yes, sir. Alex Campbell mentions featherweight Young Griffo, the guy that was supposed to be unhittable. Real name was Griffiths. Oh, yeah, Young Griffo. Yeah, I have some videos on the channel there where he is mentioned. He might have faced, Young Griffo, he might have faced, did he face Jack McAuliffe? I can't remember if he did or not. But Young Griffo, big time fighter right there. I have him on a list of guys that I wanted to do a video on. He had a ton of fights, as mentioned, but very good fighter there. I believe he fought. I could be throwing I could be wrong in that he fought Young Corbett the second. I could be wrong. That being said, check out Young Griffo, and I hope to do something on him more at some point to dive a bit deeper into him. Very interesting story. Of course, if I do a video on him, you're going to get the good, the bad, and the ugly. And of course, the ugly was pretty damn ugly. Slavin, almost the same as my first name. Interesting. Yes, sir. That is the case. The Boxing Kangaroo, damn, I'm Australian. I never heard of these guys. Hey, it's all good. The Boxing Kangaroo. These are just some guys who, over the course of time, like many boxers, some of that shine wasn't quite captured in the same way it previously had been outside of people mentioning them in some articles here or there, but we're the technological age now where we have the majority of this right out in front of us. The Boxing Kangaroo says, 86, who's your favorite Aussie heavyweight? So I would say from the standpoint of, I would say Peter Jackson as far as one who was considered to be the Australian heavyweight and Australian heavyweight champion. But if you're just talking straight up Australian heavyweight, like he was born in Australia, yeah, I'll probably go with Frank Slavin. I just think that, yeah, he was a heck of a fighter and one of those who brought a level of excitement. Wasn't a guy who would duck. He's willing to pretty much fight any heavyweight for the most part, and he had a punch on him. So I would say Peter Jackson, Frank Slavin, of course. Those are two that kind of meet the top billing for me. And then my favorite Australian fighter in general, besides that, just the favorite Australian fighter, none other than the middleweight, the great middleweight Les Darcy, who I wanted to get to as well. Now, he fought in the 1910s, that period right there, 1910s. That's when he really came to. But Les Darcy, and I do have a depiction of him, but the Boxing Kangaroo, as far as guys, my favorite Australian heavyweight, or not Australian fighter or boxer in general, none other than Les Darcy. 46-4, 29 KOs, died at the age of 21. He didn't even get a chance to fight at 21, if I'm not mistaken. And he would have been middleweight champion of the world. He was Australian middleweight champion at the time of his death. I know we're jumping through some of the heavyweights, but he was Australian middleweight champion at the time of his death. And the thing about it is he, you could consider him the best middleweight in the world, really. Now, he would have been able to, hopefully, and it didn't get to work out for a number of things, but there were periods when he could have faced, or there was a period where you think about the Michigan assassin Stanley Ketchel, Harry Greb, and their paths potentially crossing. Didn't quite work out in that capacity, though Les Darcy died here in America. He was on his way to see, or he came to America to essentially fight Harry Greb, or at least that's one of the fights he was seeking. Just did not happen. He died, so he didn't even get a chance to fight here in America. But as far as favorite Australian fighter in general, none other than the great Les Darcy. He's one of the best for sure. Definitely one of the best there. Now, let me see here. I'm catching up. I think I lost track there on some of the things. I dropped the Sullivan link in there to that video that I mentioned talking about some of the heavyweights there. Lives against just by Slavic. They're all sounds good to me. So Alexander Cameron Goddard twice, dropped Jackson twice, and was robbed out of victory. Yeah, Joe Goddard. That's another name I want to mention there. So he's another one, certainly Boxing Kangaroo to look at. So some of these guys, and sometimes the records can be deceiving. So if you look at his record, you probably pass over it and not think much. But as far as heavyweights, there probably aren't too many in the history of the sport that were as tough as none other than Joe Goddard. So he's a name certainly worth mentioning. And he fought a number of these guys. As a matter of fact, his resume is littered with top-level competition. and he started off on a hell of a trajectory. He, like Slavin, like Dooley, like Leeds, or he, like all of the rest, essentially were Australian heavyweight champions. So Joe Goddard, tough as nails right there. A lot of the losses that you see came on the back end, and in all likelihood, there are a lot of issues tied to the reason behind that. And of course, he didn't have a great life there after the sport. But that being said, Joe Goddard, hell of a fighter, one of those guys who would mix it up with anyone. Just a solid overall guy. So that's a great one mentioned there. Alexander Campbell. Dan mentions Frank Slavin, K.O. Fornan, Harry Lang, and Mick Dooley. Yeah, big-time puncher right there. As far as raw Australian heavyweights, just in general, Frank Slavin, he definitely ranks up there top billing. And he can mix it up with the best of them for sure. And that's something certainly to think about. Oh, yeah, my connection could be bad. It could be my connection as well. For some reason, it's acting funny. I need to get some troubleshooting going. Joshua started sounding like a robot whose batteries were running out. Okay, yeah, it's me. I think it is me because I've had some issues over the last week and a half. I guess you can say 2 weeks now because we're almost at Friday. So I'm gonna have to get with it for sure. Let's see here. We got some good dialogue going on. Pablo Franque was a great fighter, beat Peter Jackson in 1886, grandson of the biggest circus master in Europe. He was a P.T. Barnum of Europe and was a black man, great man, great history. Interesting stuff there. Hey, nice gym there, Dan. I'm going to have to remember that because I want to check him out for sure. That's awesome. Hey, you get some nice gyms here on the channel, folks. So salute to you all for being here that are in the mix right now. But that's awesome right there. I have to check him out. Also, Peter Felix, he is the brother of Peter Jackson, who competed as well. He had a solid resume. Of course, he didn't reach the level of Peter Jackson, but he fought a lot of these top level guys out there as well. So he's someone worth mentioning when you think about boxing down under there. Peter Felix, if you don't know him, look him up for sure. Shout out to Random Acoustic Thoughts. He had hit me up, so I had to get with him. We'll have to come on again and do maybe a part 2 with Random Acoustic Thoughts because he knows a lot about a number of the fights that were taking place in Australia as well. And so it wasn't just even the boxers there. Boz looked up Herbert Slade, half Maori, half Irish. Oh, yeah, that is the case there, Boz. Good look right there for sure. Good look. And as mentioned, I want to, we'll probably have to do a part 2 of this because, of course, you can only get through so much. But just Boz mentions Darcy was a middleweight, right? That is indeed the case there, Boz. Les Darcy. But, man, he was like a tank. He hit like a tank, fought like a tank, charged forward. We have video out there on him. I have a video on the channel. So for the Boxing Kangaroo, definitely worth checking out Les Darcy. As a matter of fact, I'll share it here, but Les Darcy, he is one you want to check out there, Boxing Kangaroo. I'm going to drop that in the chat as well for folks if you haven't seen it. I'll probably update the thumbnail. And, man, just the trajectory he was on, he could have potentially been the greatest fighter from Australia. It just didn't. Yeah, unfortunately, he died at a very young age there, as mentioned, 21 years of age. And he would have been, oh, yeah, that is right there, Dan. Yeah, he fought heavyweight. So Les Darcy, man, he was one of those guys that was certainly something special. Yeah, he was Australian heavyweight champion right there. Not a huge guy either for the standpoint of height, but, man, a stocky, solidly built guy. And something special for sure. I dropped that in the chat. But the certain one you want to check out. You could argue, Boz, at that particular period, the heavyweight competition, but the competition at middleweight was certainly not scarce there during that period there, Boz. But at heavyweight, you could argue such. because at that particular time when he was fighting, yeah, you had the world heavyweight title and it was well in rotation. So yeah, you didn't really, and that wasn't the aim, of course, for all. But you could argue, yeah, pretty scarce there. So this would have been would have been the 1910s, and then towards the back end of the 1910s as well. So therefore, yeah, you've seen somewhat of a shift right there. Now you had some top, and this is related to Australian boxers. That being said, not Australia as far as its impact to the sport and what was taking place there. So that's another element. And one of the reasons I want to do a part two, I had to get Randy McKissick thoughts on here. You had a number of the top heavyweights that were competing during the 1910s and such who were fighting over there, or even just before that, for instance, who were fighting over in Australia. Big time, one of the great promoters from Australia. I thought about him earlier. Hugh McIntosh, that's his name. Yeah, he played a major role in the sport. So you had fighters like Sam Langford, Sam McVeigh, those type of guys that were competing over there in Australia. Of course, we know Australia is where Jack Johnson defeated Tommy Burns to win the world heavyweight title. And Hugh McIntosh was behind that. As a matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, it was Hugh McIntosh. And I believe Hugh McIntosh had to be the referee in that contest. So that just shows you the role he played. So, yeah, we're going to have to touch on some of that piece of it a bit more. A lot of the guys that I've been mentioning here over the course of this discussion, these were guys who they really came to in the late 1870s through the 1880s, 1890s. When you think about the likes of Jackson, Farnan, Slavin, all those guys, we're thinking sort of in that kind of time frame right there. 1880s, really 1890s, very significant from that perspective. But we'll have to dive into it more on some of the others. Cheers there, Pete Dodge. Says, I met Joe Bugner, who fought the great Ali. Yes, unfortunately, he is not in a good way these days. That is very unfortunate. Oh, yeah, Joe Bugner, he did fight Ali there. And that's kind of the sad side of it right there. Appreciate you again there, PT Dodge. Yeah, some of these guys ultimately, yeah, they go through a lot. You think about Joe Goddard, individuals like that who had some tough careers, fought probably beyond when they should have been competing, and when it was probably just more so strictly for the check, and took some damage, and you had to think that affected them because the conditions were far worse. The boxing was less safe back in those days. Any way you slice it, that's what makes it different from these guys today. I think some of that evolution when we think about boxing was most certainly tied to the safety aspect. I've said that before. So those guys, they had it tougher. Any way you slice it, even the women who fought during that period, it was tougher. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Dan Fitzsimmons was middleweight, and look what he did to heavyweights here in America. That is true. Fitzsimmons spent time down under, of course, born in the UK and then moved down there. And that's where he was applying his trade as a blacksmith. His father had a whatever you call one of those type of shops, blacksmith shop, or at least he was involved in some capacity. And Fitzsimmons, yeah, he was down there as well. So that's someone I didn't even really get to here over the course of this, and certainly aiming for an hour, you can't get to everything. But Bob Fitzsimmons, and we know his impact to the sport. I mean, what can I say, really? And we'll throw out Jim Mace as well. So Jim Mace, he was one who actually discovered Bob Fitzsimmons. So think about the great Jim Mace. And yeah, it's like you can't mention this era. So Jim Mace, he was fighting down there. So yeah, it's like yeah, it's just such a significant role, such a significant place. And just think about that. And what really puts it into perspective, I would say, is that I kind of harken back to it earlier. Just think about how far Australia is even like for us here in modern times, if you're taking a plane to Australia, just think about how far it is. Whether you're in Norway, the United States, Canada, England, heck, whether you're in Japan, you name it. Australia is far. You know, you get a little bit closer as you go a little bit down further. But that being said, just think about that. And the fact that it played such a role and such a significance in a time where you didn't have planes. You can't take a train. You can't drive to Australia. So you were on a boat. Just think about how long that takes. Or at least how long it took then compared to now. Just think about that. So think about guys to and from Australia and what that meant when you're taking that trip. So a lot of them, they competed if you're coming from another spot, you competed in a lot of contests when you were down there in Australia, just because you're talking about a trip that takes months. You're talking about having to train, all that stuff on a boat where you're spending a significant amount of time. And then, of course, you go there and you got to come back. Or if you live there in Australia, you come to fight in the U.S., come do your thing, go back. But just think about that. So that's why I say the conditions were so far different compared to today. These guys, of course, you didn't have your phone that you were on where you could connect to the Wi-Fi and potentially study the fighters you were ultimately going to face there when you headed to Australia, or you were headed to the United States from Australia. It's not like you could sit there and watch film, do film study, things of that nature during this era that we're talking about. So you're essentially, unless you had seen a fighter, you were going in blind. Unless you had personally seen them yourself, you were going in blind. Or you may have some words from what you've heard. Maybe your trainer or some others on your team or camp in or around the sport had some information. But outside of that, you were heading to Australia or heading from Australia to take on some of these fighters during this period. You were going in there blind, and it came down to, hey, you can either fight or not. You can either put in that work or not. And that just shows you how great these guys were. Palmer trained Johnny Famchion too. Okay, good stuff right there, boss. Famchion. I've heard his name mentioned before. I'm sure I'm getting it wrong. He was your favorite fighter. Okay, that's what's up right there. Oh, was your father's favorite? Okay, got that. The boxing kangaroo. Yeah, I know it was a fighting family. Willie Pep was fighting one of them. I don't know if that's the one, but that's what's up there. Boxing kangaroo. Awesome. Your favorite is Lionel Rose. Okay, good stuff there, boxing kangaroo. Good to know. Dan, cousin of Peter Jackson, Peter Felix. Indeed. Nice. As a kid, I watched the miniseries about Rose. Okay, good stuff. Oh yeah, hey, it's all good there. Boxing kangaroo, we all do, really. Certainly always learning some stuff. Definitely. Buffalo Mark Costello, you mentioned him a number of times, Dan. I gotta check him out. I know the name, but yeah, I need to dive into him for sure. There, Dan dominated Peter Jackson in several fights, and even with Frank Slavin. Okay, that's cool. Paddy Slavin, that's what's up. So I got to check him out, Dan, for sure. So yeah, good comments there. Just Boss says, I remember even in early 2000s, they talked about Kali Meehan fought the same few guys several times because Australian heavyweight boxing was so weak. Oh, yeah, I feel you. Hey, you look at Australia, New Zealand now, they're starting to pick it up a little bit. We're getting a lot of guys coming out of there as far as just making it to this top stage, not just heavyweights, but just in general. Jay Opataya, freaking Joe Parker. You got... What's got? Sam Goodman. He's on a pretty solid trajectory right here. George Camboso, so he was able to do his thing, come out, make some noise. So yeah, you got some pretty solid stuff happening here in Australia for sure. So it was almost like a rekindling, though it's never truly left. Of course, we've always had some great fighters fighting from all different places, countries, walks of life here over the course of time. But certainly they're doing their thing right now. Just by says this should be called brushing off the heavyweight fossils. Got you there, Bob. Yeah, it can certainly be called that. And then Fitzsimmons was more of a light heavyweight naturally. Yeah, certainly. Or super middleweight, you could say in that range. Middleweight, super middleweight, And that just showed you the type of pop power he had. You can't teach, can't really train it in terms of him working out there with his father and such. Blacksmith, yeah. Holy crap. Bob says from here it takes 27 hours to Australia. So, yeah, that goes to show you're talking some distance. The boxing kangaroo, wonder how long the boat ride was back then. Much. I know it was months there, boxing kangaroo, which is crazy. Femi Sean. Okay, got you there, Femi Sean. Okay, gotcha. Appreciate their boxing kangaroo. Good stuff. Current world champs Joe Parker is from New Zealand. Yep. Yeah, he's good. Yo, yeah, Liam Paro won a 140-pound title here recently. Tim Zhu doing his thing. He's about to fight here not too long from now. I think he's still right there in the mix. You can consider him top billing there at 154. He's in the mix for sure. Hey, I'd like to see him and Crawford go at it if Crawford's competing there. Sky Nicholson. I do know Sky Nicholson as well. So, yeah, Sky Nicholson. I want her to fight Tierra Brown. Shout out to Tierra Brown. Is going to be fighting on October 12th, boxing kangaroo. But I know Sky Nicholson. I've seen her. She's nice for sure. Pete Dodge, I went to a small outback pub in far north Queensland that had old photos of indigenous people on the wall. I was told there were boxers that used to fight in circus traveling tents back then. Wow, that's crazy. That's amazing. Man, if you had pictures, that would be cool to see. Pictures of those pictures. But yeah, I wouldn't doubt it at all. I'd imagine there was some fighting going on. Yeah. We were having a conversation earlier as to whether I knew any Aboriginal fighters, and some brought up Lion Hill Rose, but I was thinking back from this time period, and I couldn't think of really any. And that's pretty crazy. So I wouldn't doubt that there were some out there competing. And then just think about boxing and the circus. I mean, that right there could be a story in itself. And we've had some champions come out of that world, Harry Lang died while heavyweight champion. Got his legs chopped off, hopping a train, drunk, died a couple days later. He also did a year in jail while heavyweight champion because he beat up a dude. Wow, that's pretty crazy there, Dan. Pretty darn crazy. Pete Dodd says we still have tit fights here. Oh, yeah. Oh, stole his 100 pounds there, Dan. That's crazy. Wow, the boxing kangaroo didn't know that. Yeah, that's crazy. Good stuff. The boxing kangaroo mentions Liam Paro's title defense is in my hometown. Okay. I have to look it up because I don't know who he's fighting. I live in North Queensland. Okay, good stuff. Liam Parley. Excuse me. Oh, I do know Tony Mundine. I didn't know he was Aboriginal. That's what's up right there. Oh, Tony Mundine. Yeah, he had a little period there in which he was doing his thing. Pretty solid middleweight. He was in a couple of the fight night games as well. So remember him there with EA Sports. So Tony Mundine. So awesome. Boxing kangaroo had a tent fight himself right there. No, that's what's up there, boxing kangaroo. But wow, that's awesome. But yeah, as mentioned, hey, we're kind of here. I mentioned about an hour, a little bit over. Gonna hit probably an hour 15 minutes. But essentially, what I wanted to say was that Australia boxing certainly can't be summed up in an hour, can't be summed up in an hour or two. It just will take some diving into these great fighters, these great warriors, and you'll tend to learn more and more as time goes on. But what I'm going to do here, I do thank everyone for joining. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to get another one on the books where we can dive into Australian boxing a bit more. There are probably different angles that we can go with this. Of course, for those interested who want to check it out, there are different angles we can go with this. One of the things is, as mentioned, I'm going to try and get random acoustic thoughts on, and we're going to talk a little bit of some of the great fights that have taken place in Australia and the significance that it played there. So that's one angle right there. And then some of these other fighters didn't really get a chance to get to, as time goes on and on. We have some footage out there. Sam Langford against Bill Lang. That's something we have footage of. Of course, Les Darcy didn't get to dive into him as much, but do check out the video I dropped in the chat. You'll learn a good deal more about Les Darcy. But yeah, there were so many others. So this is just only, a microcosm, really. As mentioned, there's so many of those guys that were competing and at such a high level back then that, you can't just get through it all in one setting right there. So we'll do this again, Australia, but certainly to that initial question you had there, Boxing Kangaroo, as far as Australia, man, the history of boxing, you cannot tell its story without Australia. We see a surge here right now, as mentioned, but just thinking about back then, man, some of the great fighters in the sport have come from Australia. Alexander Kevin says, well, guys, have a good evening. Won't be seeing me for a good while. I'm going to Ukraine, put my 18 Zulu MOS, 30 years experience, contracting experience, helping warriors in my mother's hometown. Hey, salute there to you, Alex Campbell. If you're still here, man, you are appreciated for sure. I know we had some discussions about Ukraine, etc. Viva Ukraine, of course. Hey, we're supporting you there, Alex. If anything is needed, hey, don't hesitate to reach out. No doubt about it. I mean that 100%. Fellow veteran right there. So good stuff there, Alex, for sure. So we'll be on the lookout for you. Stay safe for sure. But yeah, thanks everyone who dropped in. Dan mentions got it shot in the head by Philly police. Yeah, that's unfortunate. Very unfortunate right there for sure. But yeah, hey, thank you to there, Mr. Dodge. But thanks all. Thanks all that joined up. Again, we'll connect again for sure. We're going to talk more Australian boxing because there's just so much that we can get to there. But thanks to everyone who dropped by, and I'll see you at some point soon. Very